Hello. In the Gospels, we will consider the question of violence and self-defense, looking at several passages. To look at passages in the four Gospels, a book such as this is very handy. A harmony of the Gospels. This one, Stevens and Burton's, is an old but good one, made about the turn of the century. It was made long enough ago that it's in the public domain as far as copyright, and thus you'd probably be able to find it on the internet in ebook downloadable form. Well then, in considering this issue, there are several passages to look at. A gospel harmony tends to put similar passages in parallel columns. All right, the first passage to consider well here in Matthew 5:38. Ye have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye, and a tooth for a tooth. But I say unto you, resist not him that is evil, but whosoever smiteth thee on thy right cheek, turn to him the other also. And if any man would go to law with thee and take away thy coat, let him have thy cloak also. And whosoever shall compel thee to go 1 mile, go with him twain, which means 2. Give to him that asketh thee, and from him that would borrow of thee, turn not thou away. Similar is found in Matthew 6, Jesus teaching his disciples, but I say unto you which hear, love your enemies, do good to them that hate you, bless them that curse you, pray for them that despitefully use you. To him that smiteth thee on the one cheek, offer also the other. And from him that taketh away thy cloak, withhold not thy coat also. Give to every one that asketh thee, and of him that taketh away thy goods, ask them not again. The Matthew passage appears to be more absolute, and I want to focus first some remarks upon that because it actually says, turn the other cheek and so forth, but it also actually says, resist not him that is evil, which seems pretty absolute, resist not him that is evil, here in Matthew 5. The context of everything in studying the Gospels, at the very least, it has to mean something. Some type of self-defense, according to the teaching of Jesus, is restricted. This we see in both Matthew and Luke. It actually says, resist not him that's evil. And I think in the context this means that weapons to defend ministry are restricted. We must remember the audience is disciples, which in the Sermon on the Mount, these were his trainee ministers, who we also refer to as apostles. And in the Lord's Prayer, as we are familiar with, it does actually say, deliver us from evil. I think part of the idea of weapons not to be used in defense of ministry is that this would be contrary to trust in God's defense and God defending the ministry. A modern application of this is that chaplains usually are not armed, even if they're members of the armed services. Because of their calling, chaplains are not armed. Now let's look at something else here. We next look at Luke 22. Now look at this one, which is interesting and rather curious. This is in the context of Jesus and his disciples at the Last Supper. And he said unto them, When I sent you forth without purse and wallet and shoes, lacked ye anything? And they said, Nothing. And he said unto them, But now he that hath a purse, let him take it, and likewise a wallet. And he that hath none, let him sell his cloak, and buy a sword. For I say unto you, that this which is written must be fulfilled in me. And he was reckoned with transgressors, for that which concerneth me hath fulfillment. And they said, Lord, behold, here are 2 swords. And he said unto them, It is enough. And in this gospel harmony, note the uniqueness of this incident. Only Luke narrates this incident in the life and sayings of our Lord to his disciples. Nothing like it in other gospels. Finally, let us turn to the scene of Jesus' arrest here in Matthew 26 and parallels. Look, for example, at 26:51. And behold, one of them that were with Jesus stretched out his hand and drew his sword and smote the servant of the high priest and struck off his ear. Then saith Jesus unto him, Put up again thy sword into its place. For all that take the sword shall perish with the sword. Or thinkest thou that I cannot beseech my Father, and he shall even now send me more than 12 legions of angels? How then should the scriptures be fulfilled, that thus it must be? I believe all the Gospels narrated that a follower of Jesus actually smote with the sword and injured a servant of the high priest. It's Matthew and Luke that have most detail on this here. So now we look at the parallel in Luke 22. And a certain one of them smote the servant of the high priest and struck off his right ear. But Jesus answered and said, Suffer ye thus far. And he touched his ear and healed him. Now, the rebuke in Matthew 26 is certainly less sharp than what we find in Luke 22, Suffer ye thus far, which I guess I would explain in somewhat more modern language. Allow them to do what they're doing. My disciple, you should not resist, or at least not resist any further. So this interesting trio of passages, what we've just looked at and the previous one in Luke 22:35. Luke 22:35 and following definitely permits the disciples to be armed, because that's what swords are for. They are for force. But later in Luke 22 and in Matthew 26:51, their use is restricted. In the context, definitely, even though they are allowed to be armed, they are not permitted to use those arms to keep Christ from being arrested, which goes with my previous analysis, at least, that violence and force are not permitted for the defense of the ministry. You see? Now, Luke doesn't really explain this earlier passage, in 22. He says, it doesn't fully explain, at least, this matter of, he now says that the disciples may and should be armed on the night that Jesus was arrested. It does indicate that it goes with the previous ministry restrictions. However, they went out without money and without a change of sandals and so forth and like that. But now things will be different. And as part of things being different, they may be armed. Yet they can easily take this to an extreme, and their being armed could be construed by them in a way that Jesus does not intend them, namely for the defense of the ministry. Well, if they are not to personally defend themselves, if that is restricted in important ways, why would they ever be permitted for any reason to bear arms? May I offer a possible explanation? This is not in the text, but it's a possible explanation. There was no police back then. There was no police force. And if you went about carrying money, for instance, you needed to protect that against robbery, even in a city, or you might well have it stolen from you, even in a city. And the disciples, we know from other passages in the Gospels, the disciples and Jesus gathered money in order to give it to the poor. So carrying arms, for example, in order to protect the money that they collected to give to the poor, that wouldn't in the same sense be personal self-defense, but that would be protecting the money which they collected to give to the poor so that it wouldn't be stolen from them, and they could in fact give it to the poor, and the poor would not go hungry. Just a possible explanation, and I think it does justice to the historical context then. No regular police. Cities might have a city guard patrolling the streets in those days, looking out for brigands and robbers, and you would be more subject to brigands and robbers in the countryside, where in general there were no such forces patrolling. And in that sense, self-defense is recognized in the scriptures, and I think even in the Gospels, in spite of their seemingly being so absolute in restricting personal self-defense. And that does mean something, let me emphasize. Christians, followers of Jesus, should not be personally vengeful sort of people. It's just a study in the Gospels. There's more to say about this from the rest of the scriptures, which would analyze into from the rest of the New Testament and certainly from the Old Testament. Till next time.